So this is what you guys should have when you first open up Maya. And I just kind of want to go over the layout real quick. There's a lot of items here. Most of it we're not going to be using. So there's just a couple specific things that we want to touch upon. First and foremost, this is your perspective view. This is what we're going to do most of our modeling in. You'll notice there's a little perspective name. Each viewport will have a name to it, and that becomes important, so just know that that exists down there. On the left-hand side, you have a toolbar that allows you to cycle through different viewport layouts. So right now we're in this top one, which is just our perspective view. If you click the next one down, you'll have your 4 viewports, which is typical to any modeling software. You have perspective, side, front, and top. If you click one more, it's just going to give you front and perspective. And then this 4th one down is going to pop open this little outliner tab. I'll explain what this is later. My preference is to have your perspective view open along with the outliner. So you guys can just keep that open, and we'll get to it a little bit later. Along the top, you have your basic menu. File, we'll just do a quick save scene. So anytime you want to save a file, it's called save scene. So any Maya file is called a scene. So I'm just going to click that, and I'll save it somewhere on my computer. And then click continue if you're using a student version. You have your edits, which you have copy, paste, duplicate. We'll get into some of this stuff a little bit later. And then there's a whole mess of other menu items up here, and we're just going to kind of go through one by one once we have some geometry created. One thing to know, there's this little drop down menu up here. If you change this, your menus up at the top are going to change. So if I go from modeling to rigging, see these menu items have changed up here. So if I'm on a menu, or I'm going to menus up here that don't match what your Maya file shows, it's probably because this has changed. So we're going to keep it under modeling for now, and we'll go through the rest a little later. The other thing you can look at up at the very top is this workspace layout. You should always be sticking with Maya Classic, at least that's what I use. That's sort of the default layout that appears anytime you install Maya onto a computer. And I've never really changed that at all. So that's kind of your first row of menu items. Your second row is sort of shortcuts to the top menu. So you have open, save, undo, redo. There's some couple snapping options, and again, we'll kind of get through this while we kind of pull through the rest of the tutorial. These are all your rendering icons. And then the next toolbar down is a lot of your commands. So how to create geometry, lines, things like that. You've got curves and surfaces. So this is all of your curve commands, how to draw curves. These are NURB surfaces, so cubes, cylinders, cones. We're not going to use these. I'll get into that a little bit later. What we're really concerned with is the next tab over, your poly modeling tab. All of the modeling we'll do in Maya is poly modeling, so they're meshes. Which is different from something like Rhino 3D, which models in NURBS. Meshes just render faster. There's more editability with them in Maya. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then there's a whole mess of other tabs up here, some of which we'll use, most of them we won't. But that's just kind of where all of these commands sort of live. So usually I just leave the poly modeling tab open, as that's the one we'll use the most. Your next menu bar down from there, this is specific to your viewport. So it's got things like camera settings, shading settings, lighting. We'll get into this stuff a little bit later. But what you'll notice is that if I click my 4 viewport icon, I've got that menu for each viewport. So any settings that you change using these menu icons are only going to affect that specific viewport. It won't affect all of them. And so I'm going to click back to my perspective view. So just know that that's how this last menu set works. A shortcut command to switching viewports, rather than clicking over here, is tapping the spacebar while your mouse is hovering over your viewport. So if I just set my mouse here and I tap the spacebar, it's going to toggle between 4 viewports and a single viewport. So I can just keep tapping spacebar, and whichever viewport my mouse is hovering over is the viewport that it's going to maximize. So you can just keep tapping. If this ever gets messed up, like you're seeing duplicate viewports or anything like that, just come back to here, click this 4 viewport icon, and that should kind of reset things for you. But we're going to stick here. The menu bar on the right. These are your object properties. Nothing is here right now because we have no objects in our scene. But once we start populating and creating geometry, you'll notice these things pop up. Channel boxes, just very basic geometry editing. Attributes are more advanced settings. And then your model toolkit. I usually don't use this that often. I use all the tools that are found up in the menus up here. But there's sort of quick commands here if you want to dive into that a little bit later on once you have an idea of what each command can do. If for some reason these menus go away, you can pull them back up with these icons here. So that's your channel box. These are tool settings. That's a completely separate menu altogether. We'll get into that a little later. This is your attribute editor, and this is your modeling toolkit. So if these disappear, you can just click these icons and they'll come back. This guy here is human IK. That's like rigging for characters. We're not going to get into that. So I usually just leave this as the channel box for now. Down here you'll see an option for layers. Don't use it. It's just my personal opinion. I don't like layers in Maya. We'll organize all of our geometry through our outliner. So we'll get into that a little later. And then at the bottom you've got what's called your time slider, and this is where we do all of our animation and keyframing. I'm going to be using the word keyframe a lot. Basically what that means is to set an object at a specific location at a certain point in time. So when I say keyframe an object, it means I've locked it into that position within my modeling space at that moment in time. And then your time is down here, and this is based on frames. So 1 through 120 right now is showing, which means I have 120 frames. This down here, this little bar, allows you to kind of zoom in and out of your time slider. So originally, by default, it's set to 120, which means I'm viewing frames from 1 to 120. If I maximize this, I can pull it out to 200, and now I'm viewing frames 1 to 200. And then I can also zoom in to like the center. And now I'm only viewing frames 73 to 97. This becomes useful a little later on. You'll find that out. Just know that that's what that toolbar does. On the left-hand side, this is your start frame. On the right-hand side, this is your end frame. This can be set to whatever number you want it to be, depending on how long you want your animation to occur. Don't worry about these. Your frames per second, we'll get into that a little later. And then these items over here, don't worry about. This is your play icon to preview your animation. And these allow you to step forward 1 frame, step back 1 frame, go to the end of your animation, jump to the beginning. And then this number here is the current frame that you're on. So if I cycle through this by just clicking and dragging, that number will update. Or if I want to set myself to a specific frame, I can do that as well. And then down at the very bottom hand corner, that's your script editor for any kind of coding you want to do. And we are going to use that at some point for some rendering, but we'll get to that a little at the end. How you determine the length of your animation. Maya's animation is set to be measured in frames, and how long an animation is depends upon what your frame rate is of the video that you're producing. I typically render out any animation at 30 frames per second. You can go as low as 24. If you go lower than 24, you're going to start noticing a skipping in your animation because your eye visually starts to read each individual image. 30 frames a second is pretty good. If you want to do really high def, super slow-mo animations, then you have to pump up to like 60 or 120. But there's not really any reason for us to do that. So if I'm running an animation that is 30 frames a second, what that means is that I'm rendering out a single image, 30 of them, for each second of my animation. So if I want my animation to be 10 seconds long, I need to have 300 frames if I'm going to render that out at 30 frames a second. So 30 frames times 10 seconds, that's 300 frames. Maya is going to render out 300 individual images. Those images will then be taken into AfterEffects and compiled into your animation. So that's what we're going to kind of try and do by the end of this tutorial, is take Maya, have it render out our images, our image sequence, and then we'll pull that image sequence into AfterEffects, which then produces the video. You don't actually render out a movie directly from Maya. Maya only ever renders out images. So that's how that kind of works. So you need to do some kind of upfront math to determine how long you want your animation to be. We're going to do a 10-second long animation at 30 frames a second. So I'm going to set my end frame to be 300. I'm going to hit enter. And then I'm going to set this number to be 300 as well, so I maximize my frame window here to see every single frame. So you guys can just kind of keep that there, and then I'm going to set my start frame to 1. So Maya has a ton of tools with it. It's got very primitive geometry manipulation tools to some incredibly advanced manipulation tools, all of which can be animated if you know where to go. So for this tutorial, all we're really going to do is animate basic movement or transform commands, like transition from point A to point B. We'll do rotational movements, and we'll do scaling movements as well. So let's jump into this and creating some really basic geometry. I'm going to come up to the top here under Poly Modeling tab. Just kind of remember that orange icons are good, blue icons are bad. Blue icons are your NURB surfaces. Those render differently. They have different commands. We're not going to touch those. So we want to be under Poly Modeling, orange commands. All of these icons over here are your primitive pieces of geometry. So you have sphere, cube, cylinder, cone, torus, flat plane, and a flat disk. This is sort of a multifaceted object. For now, I'm just going to stick with cubes, sort of the easiest thing to do. I recommend that everyone model with solid objects instead of using a flat plane for any kind of modeling. It makes future techniques in Maya a little bit easier. We kind of want everything to have some thickness or some volume to it. So if you want an effect like a flat plane, I would recommend creating a cube and then just scaling it down so it has a very minimal thickness to it. So I'm just going to click this little cube icon. And what that's going to do is drop down a cube onto our grid here. You'll also notice that if you pull up your outliner, again, that's this little icon down here. If for some reason that icon's not there, you can go up to Window, Outliner, and your outliner is going to track everything that's in your scene. So I just created this cube, and the name of that cube is pcube1. You'll also notice there's a couple other things in this outliner. These are your cameras, your default cameras, so your viewports basically. You'll notice we're in perspective. And then these are your two default light sets. Don't delete those, don't change them, just leave them the way they are. You can select objects by clicking and dragging, single clicking, or clicking in your outliner. I recommend to keep your outliner as organized as possible. We'll go into that a little bit further once we have some more geometry put down on the screen. But this is how you track and organize your Maya files. I use this instead of layers. A couple of selection tools. So right now, this is when I select this object, it's green. That means we're in object mode. Which means I'm selecting the whole object all at one time. We're just going to stick with that for now for basic transform tools, but there's other ways to select the object. We'll get into that a little bit later. The first thing I really want to go over is how you pan, orbit, and rotate around our cube. Navigating your viewport is all done by holding down the Alt key on your keyboard, and then you left mouse click to rotate. You right mouse click to zoom in and out, and you middle mouse click to pan. So you need a mouse that has all three buttons. You can also scroll your middle mouse wheel to zoom in and out, but I usually just use the Alt and right click and drag command. So again, it's hold Alt, left mouse button to rotate, right mouse button to zoom in and out, middle scroll wheel button to pan. So your middle scroll wheel on your mouse has to be clickable. In order to kind of zoom in an object, you select it and hit F on your keyboard, and that's sort of your zoom selected command. So now I'm rotating locally around that object. Okay, that's sort of how you navigate. One thing I want everybody to notice is down in the bottom left, your up axis is Y in Maya, which is different from most other programs. Rhino's default is Z. Just keep that in the back of your head while you're working. Do not change that. If you change it, it's going to cause a bunch of lighting issues and a bunch of settings, so we're going to leave it as Y is up. There are other ways. When we get into exporting and importing geometry from other pieces of software, there are ways to kind of resolve any issues that might come up with dealing with other pieces of software where they do not use Y is up in your axis. So just kind of keep that in mind, that up is Y. Let's see. Units. Let's look at that for a sec. If you go into Windows, Settings, Preferences, and you go under Settings, default working units are centimeters. I don't ever change that, but just to give you an idea of how big this cube is, by default, it's a 1 by 1 by 1 cube. So it's 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So I'm just going to close that. I don't change that. I usually just keep it the way it is. Again, when you change that kind of setting, it messes around with a whole host of other settings, lighting, and things like that that we don't really want to mess around with. So I'll just keep it as centimeters. Maya is very poor at creating specific measured values. Typically, I do everything by eye. Sometimes I'll start in another program where I'll set up a massing that I know is 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, or I'll create a block that is about the size of a person, and I'll bring that into Maya, and I'll do all of my modeling based on proportions to that person or to that space. So just kind of be aware that there's no real measuring tool or distance tool. It just doesn't work very well. So it's really going to train you guys to kind of model or generate ideas proportionally. When you select your cube, what you're going to notice is on the right hand side, you've got your channel box is going to start to present information about that cube. So right now by default, the cube is located at 0, 0, 0 on our grid, the center of the cube. Its rotate values are 0, so it has not been rotated at all, and its scale values are all set to 1. These are the values we're going to start to keyframe when we make things move around our screen. But that's basically what the channel box is giving us. And this little visibility icon or toggle is whether or not it's going to show in a rendering. So let's kind of start moving this cube around our model space. So I'm going to pan out a little bit. I'm going to go into our channel box just so I can show you what's happening. Basic move, rotate, and scale commands are done with W, E, and R on your keyboard. So I'm going to select the cube. If I hit W, it's going to pop open my gimbal, and I'll have arrows that I can drag it along. So if I drag it along the green arrow, that's moving it up and down. And you're going to notice that these numbers here update as I move this thing around. So your arrows move it constrained to the axes in which those arrows are pointing, which right now are aligned to my world axis down here. So Y, Z, and X. If I grab it in the middle, that's kind of free transform, so it's moving it in all 3 axes. Rotate is hitting E on your keyboard, and again it has those same axes, so I can click and drag along the arcs and rotate the cube along these axes. The circle around the outside is rotating it perpendicular to the point of view of the camera. Okay, and then you've got green, red, and blue as your 3 main points of axis rotations. Okay, and then the last tool is hitting R on your keyboard to pull up the scale tool. And you can click and drag on the center box to scale it uniformly, or you can click on one of these outer boxes to scale it along that axis. And then you can also click on the panels to do kind of a scale 2D. In order to reset this cube, you can come up to your channel box. I'm just going to click and drag on the first 6 values, so my translate and rotate values. I'm going to type 0, hit enter, and it's going to kind of reset that cube. To reset the scale values, you'll select those, type 1, and hit enter. And now that cube is sort of reset back to its original position. And then you can hit F on your keyboard to zoom selected to get it back to that location. Or kind of get your camera back to focused on the new size of your cube. So W, E, and R, those are your basic movement, rotate, and scale commands. Q will put you back to your selection, so your arrow tool. Nothing will pop up. We can kind of bring down a couple more pieces of geometry. We've got a cylinder and a sphere. I'll kind of bring down all 3 of these at one time. Some of the things I want to show you guys in terms of sort of your subdivisions that are more apparent on rounded objects than they are on square or faceted objects. I'm going to select the sphere and go in my attribute editor and go to my polysphere 1. And those subdivisions, you'll notice they're set to 20 and 20, but you'll notice if I zoom in, this is a really faceted object, right? I can see the facets of my sphere. It's also going to render that way. So if you want to make it look more smooth, you can up the subdivisions, and that sphere is going to look way less faceted. Okay, same thing with the cylinder and its rounded edges. I can go to my poly cylinder 1 and I can change the subdivision axes to be more dense so that I get a higher resolution curve all the way around. But that's sort of the basics behind poly modeling. Is there's no truly curved piece of geometry. It's all done by faceted edges, and the denser your object is, the more refined that curve is going to be. So I'm just going to select both of those and delete them, because we won't need those. In order to duplicate objects, it's Control-D is the shortcut for that. So if I do Control-D, you're not going to notice a difference because it literally copies and pastes that object right on top of itself. But you'll notice in your outliner a second cube has popped up. I can then move it off to the side, and I'll have two objects. So again, that's just Control-D, move it up. So what we're going to do is kind of look at how we can orient these objects from one to the next, and create different kinds of relationships between each one of these pieces of geometry. Right now you'll notice that your gimbal by default is always located at the center of your cube. But there is a way to modify that. For example, if I wanted this cube to sit directly on top of this one, rather than eyeballing it, I can actually snap it. And in order to do that, what you're going to do is hold down D on your keyboard. When you do that, you'll notice the gimbal changes a little bit. So now if I click and drag on the gimbal, it kind of allows me to change the location of the gimbal in reference to piece of geometry that's being selected. And then if you hold down V on your keyboard, it'll pull up a different kind of gimbal, and this is your snapping tool. So again, that's D for dog, allows you to kind of freewheel, and then V allows you to snap. What you want to do is hold down both D and V at the same time. And what that's going to do is allow me to snap this gimbal to a corner. Okay, you can't snap it to an edge. It's only snapping to where vertices are located on this cube, but it'll allow me to snap it. And then what I can do is, now that that is snapped to the corner of this cube, I'll hold down V only, and then I can snap it to the corner of any other cube. Okay, so that allows you to get some more precise movements between multiple pieces of geometry. And all you have to do is kind of like hover over close to where that corner is, and it'll automatically snap it. Then what you can do is go to Modify up at the top and do Center Pivot. And that's going to allow you to kind of recenter your gimbal on that piece of geometry. So now this cube is snapped directly to the top of that cube. You can drag select multiple pieces of geometry and kind of move them all at one time. And then if you want, like let's say I want to take both of these cubes and snap it to the face of this geometry, I'm going to hold D and V down at the same time, click and drag on the gimbal, which will allow me to snap it to any corner. I'm going to release, and then I'm going to hold down V only so it snaps the geometry. And now I've kind of created that L shape. All right, so that's how you modify the gimbal to allow you to move pieces of geometry in relationship to its corners. And then what I'll do is I'll go to Modify, Center Pivot to each one of these to bring that gimbal back to its center. This also allows you to rotate your cube on different axis points. So right now, if I turn on my Rotate tab, it's going to rotate it along the center. Do Control-Z to undo that. But if I hold down D and V at the same time and I snap this to a corner, now it's going to allow me to rotate that cube along its edge. Okay, so it's just a different way of rotating or changing the center point of rotation around your geometry. And I'll go to Modify, and center pivot. Okay. You'll notice that your render view, when you start aligning pieces of geometry, you don't see the edges anymore. If it helps, you can come up to this little icon up here, sort of the white outlined cube with blue faces. If you click that, it'll turn on your edges. That might help some of you out. And then you can also turn on wireframe if that helps as well by toggling these up here. These checkered spheres are for materials, so we don't have any, so I'm not going to worry about those right now. So now I've got these three pieces of geometry. And you can use, again, if you turn on your scale tool, I can relocate holding down D and V, and I can change the way this thing scales. So if I just want like one side to grow, I can show my scale tool on one face, and then it'll grow off of that one face. Okay. And then I'm going to center that pivot. The last thing I'm going to show you guys how to do is reorient the gumball in relationship to your piece of geometry. So for example, if I pull this up and then I rotate it and I go back to my move tool, you'll notice that in this case the gumball didn't rotate with the rotation of the cube. Okay, the scale tool did, but the move tool did not. So let's say I want to reorient this so that the move tool is referencing the direction or rotation of the piece of geometry. What I'm going to do is come up to this little icon up here, this toolbox icon. I'm going to click that, and it's going to open up these tool settings. Now this menu changes depending on which tool I have activated. So if I switch from my move tool to my rotate tool, you'll notice these change a little bit, and then to my scale tool and they change again. They'll change even more depending on which tool you activate from these menus up here. So there's a whole host of options that are tool specific that you can mess around with through this menu. And what you'll notice is if I go to my move tool, the axis orientation is set to world, which means the orientation of this gimbal is going to match the orientation of my X, Y, and Z axes down here at the bottom left. Okay. If I wanted to change that, I can drop this down and set it to object. And notice how it reorients the move tool to the orientation of the cube. Okay. I usually just switch between object and world depending on how I want this object to move. So if I want to drag it along that axis, I can, or if I want to drag it along sort of the world axes, I can switch it to world, and then that will let me drag it straight up, straight down, left, right, back, and front. Okay, there's a lot of other options here: component, parent, normal. I don't usually use most of these things, but you can cycle through to see what they do to your tool. You can also do custom orientations if that helps as well. Another thing to note is your step snap. I've had this turn on for some people for some reason. If you turn it on, it's going to force you to move in a series of steps that are defined by this number. I usually always leave that off. I'm never trying to be that specific with how far an object moves. I usually just eyeball it all the time. But yeah, you can cycle through just kind of object and world depending on how you want this object to kind of move around your space. And again, once you start keyframing things, you usually want to leave that gimbal alone. So if I start keyframing this thing while the gimbal is in world, I usually just want to leave it in world. I don't want to change it after I've keyframed stuff. Same thing with object. Okay. So then what we're going to do is I'm just going to have you guys create sort of just like a really generic massing out of these 3 cubes. So I'm just going to real quickly kind of scale this down and pull it out so I have one sort of flat plane. I'll intersect them. I'll scale this one up so I have sort of a column condition, and then I'll just scale this up so it's, and then you can kind of intersect all 3 of them. Select them all and just kind of push this up some. Right now these are really tiny, so everything is like 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters or so. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale these up a little bit more, just so everything's a little bit bigger on the screen. There's no reason to be working that small. So we'll just kind of like push these over. I'm going to widen this. Just kind of work out something like that. So that's how you make a really generic massing model using just your transform tools. What we're going to get into next is how to do some more advanced manipulation tools that allow you to kind of modify geometry based on pulling and pushing edges of a piece of geometry, its face, its vertices. And then we'll also get into importing geometry from another piece of software. So if you guys want to create something that's really detailed in like SketchUp or Rhino 3D, where you might be a little bit more proficient, you guys will be able to import that geometry into Maya and then animate it. So we'll get into that as well. I do want to go over some other additional ways to edit and manipulate your geometry that you might run into. You're not going to use these often, not for this tutorial anyways, but I want you to know that they are available in case you run into them or certain things start happening that you're not really used to or haven't seen before. The first major point I want to make when it comes to editing geometry is that you can edit geometry by selecting different parts of it. Right now, by default, we're in object mode, which means when I select the object, I select the whole object and it becomes highlighted in that green outline. Okay, but you can select an object's individual faces, edges, and vertices. What you're going to do is select the object and then hold down right click, and this menu is going to pop up. You'll notice you have object mode, which is current, edge, vertex, vertex face, face, multi, and UV. And what I'm going to do, so if I want to select the edges, I can hover over edge and release my right mouse button. You're going to notice the edges change to like a highlighted blue. And if I hover over them, it turns red and I can pick it. Okay. Then if I turn on my move tool, I can take that edge and move it outwards, or I can move it upwards, inwards. Okay, if I hold down right click and go to vertice, I can select individual vertices on this object and move them individually. And then I can also do the same thing for faces. So hold down right click and go to face and pull this out and pull this out. Okay. Editing a piece of geometry so it transforms as if this face is being moved around is a much more advanced technique. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But I just want you to know that it is possible to select geometry using different parts of this generic piece. So it's faces, edges, and vertices. In order to get back to object mode, you hold down right click, go into object mode and release, and you'll go back to selecting the whole object. Okay. The second thing or the second way to edit a piece of geometry I want to show you is sort of a quick introduction into what's called soft modeling. Maya was developed for character creation and manipulation. So human beings, animals, all of those kinds of things. None of them have hard edges like this. And so Maya developed what's called soft modeling, which is when you convert a piece of geometry into something that is more skin-like or blob-like or deformable. And Maya's made it incredibly easy to sort of transition back and forth between faceted objects and what are called smoothened objects. So what I want you to do is select an object and then just tap 3 on your keyboard, the number 3. And what that's going to do is smoothen over that object. Okay. Then if you tap 1, it's going to go back into its faceted version. So it's 3 and 1, which are going to kind of toggle between those two different types of geometry. What Maya has developed is a set of mathematical values that when you hit 3 on your keyboard, all of the edges and corners are applied a certain fillet. So they get rounded over. And that's how you create these kind of elastic-y or more character-like pieces of geometry. And you can still manipulate this object in the same manner that you manipulate any faceted object as well. You have your scale tools. You can select the vertices and kind of pull them out. You'll notice my gimbal is way off over here, and that's because it's referencing the faceted version of the object. And so you can kind of pull these objects around. We aren't going to do any modeling like this. I'm not going to dive into it. There are plenty of tutorials online if you guys want to kind of look at that stuff separately. For now, I just want everyone to stay in faceted mode. Just know that if at any point in time during Maya while you're modeling, if things start to look weird and rounded over like that, it's probably because you're in your softened or smoothened version of that object. So just select it, hit 1, and it'll go back to its faceted form. 2 is kind of the in-between stage. It'll give you the smoothened version with the faceted wireframe around it. So I'm just going to do all of this and get it back to its base form. So those are the two big different ways of creating and editing geometry beyond sort of platonic shapes like cubes and spheres. So just kind of keep your geometry platonic for now while we run through this tutorial, and then we'll get into more of those advanced editing techniques a little later. Just know that if you accidentally hit 3 on your keyboard, it's going to round over or smoothen your shape. And if you hold down right click, it could possibly change the way you're selecting your object. And so we're just going to stay in object mode with our faceted planes here, or faceted rectangles. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to go over in terms of creating geometry is how to import geometry from a different program. I've kind of started a blank Maya file, so I have no geometry in my scene right now. Just kind of keep everything clean and simple. And what we're going to do is I'll show you guys how to export out of Rhino 3D and import into Maya. It's sort of a similar process across any 3D modeling program, but we'll use Rhino 3D for this. So I've got this Rhino 3D model. This came out of a tutorial for Rhino where I went over how to model an architectural massing based on Peter Eisenman's House 6 diagrams. And the tutorial kind of ended with this massing model. So what we're going to do is export this out and import it into Maya so we can use animation as a tool to manipulate it further. This model is kind of comprised of a couple different parts. It's got a few thinner planes that have some openings and some chunks kind of carved out of them. It's got these sort of thicker masses over here. One has sort of a router or routed channel cut out of it. And then these are sort of 4 individual massing objects. And then 2 individual columns. So the intent is going to be to export this out and then import it into Maya so that we can individually select each one of these in Maya. And that way we can keyframe them and animate them. So there's a couple steps involved. The first is to convert this to a mesh. Rhino 3D models everything in what is called NURBS surfaces. Maya 3D models in what's called polygons or meshes. So we just have to convert this over to a mesh so we can properly import it into Maya. So the first thing I'm going to do is select this and type mesh and hit enter. Now we're dealing with faceted planes, so there's no curvature, which means I can keep the polygon count down as low as possible. If you have something with a curved surface like tubes or anything like that, you're going to want to put this all the way up just so that your polygon density is as high as it can be. I can show you real quick why that matters, just so you have a visual of it. If I have 2 spheres, and let's say I want to turn this to a mesh, and I leave this all the way down and I click OK. When I delete the NURB surface, when that mesh polygon count is turned all the way down, you're going to get a really faceted mesh. Okay. If I select the other sphere and I type mesh, and I put this all the way up, and I click OK, you're going to notice that the mesh it makes is much more dense, and it actually looks like it's curved. Okay, you don't get that faceted look. All right, so that's why it's important to understand mesh density when you start converting from a NURB surface to a mesh or a polygon. But because none of this has curvature to it, I can keep that polygon count down as much as possible. And again, the reason why we have to convert from a NURB surface to a mesh is because they're 2 different pieces of software which deal with geometry in 2 very different ways. So we have to run through that process first. If you're exporting out of something like SketchUp, SketchUp kind of models in meshes anyways, so you'll just export out of SketchUp. Normally you don't really have to convert anything. So what we're going to do is I'll just select this, type mesh, turn my polygon count down all the way, click OK. So what it's done is it's created the mesh version of this massing and kind of stuck it underneath. So you can see all these lines kind of popped up. And so what it's done is I've got the mesh underneath, and it keeps the NURBS version of that model in place, and that's what's still selected. So I'm just going to hit escape to kind of deselect everything, and I'm going to type SELMESH to select that mesh, and I'm just going to kind of move it off to the side so you can see what that mesh now looks like. Okay, don't worry about all these excess edges, those are okay. We're just going to kind of leave those the way they are. The important thing is that all of this I can still select individually, okay, each part or each component. So we have our mesh, and the next thing to do is to export this out as a .obj file type. OBJs are kind of the standard for exporting and importing meshes between different modeling software. So we're going to do that. And the one thing you need to know is that you cannot export this whole thing at one time. So like I can't select all of this and export it as a single OBJ and import it into Maya. That's because if you were to do that, when you import it into Maya, the whole thing will be one selectable object. You don't want that. You want to be able to make sure that you can select each individual part of this massing model. So we kind of have to go through and export each part individually. So I'm going to start with this guy over here. I'll type export, We're going to pick a spot to save all these to. Under Save As Type, you want to make sure that says OBJ. And I'm just going to call this Massing 1. And click Save. You're going to get this little OBJ Export Options box that pops up. Just make sure that Polygon Mesh Objects is checked. And then under Formatting, you want to make sure that Map Rhino Z to OBJY is also checked. That's because if you look down at your world axes in Rhino, you'll notice that your Z axis is your up axis. If you go into Maya, you'll notice that Y is your up axis. So if you were to uncheck this, when you import this object into Maya, it would come in sideways. We don't want that, so just make sure that's checked, and then you can click OK. Once you export it, you don't need the mesh anymore. I usually just delete them. That way I can keep track of what I've already exported and what I haven't. So I'm just going to go through and export each object out as its own OBJ file. Okay, so I've exported out all of those meshes. So we'll hop over into Maya and we'll start importing them. So I'm going to go to File, Import, and then navigate to that folder location where you saved all the massing models to and start importing these. So I'll bring in Massing 1, click Import, and you're going to notice that nothing kind of plopped in on the screen. That's because it imported that massing model to the same location in my modeling space as it was in my Rhino file. 3D modeling programs intentionally coordinate the location of geometry within your modeling space. That way, when you're switching back and forth between different programs, you can always kind of control where things land and keep coordinated models that way. So if we go into our Rhino file, that massing model kind of was way over here, kind of far away from our center point of our modeling space. So if we hop into Maya and just kind of zoom out some, eventually it's going to show up. You can also just select it in your outliner, hit F on your keyboard, and you're going to zoom into that object. So I'm going to go through and import the rest of those massing models. And you can hit G on your keyboard to repeat the command, the import command. Just kind of makes things a little quicker. Okay, so I have all those objects in here. And what you'll notice in my outliner, I can select each one individually. There are just a couple steps that we want to do before we start, modifying the geometry that's in here. The first one is that you want to weld all of your vertices together. What I mean by that is if I switch to my vertex mode, again I hold down right click and switch over to vertice. Let's just pick one of these vertices and look in on it. Okay. Proper modeling would say that there's only one vertice here, right? But if I just click on it and I open up my move tool and I pull this up and out, what you'll notice is that this vertice is not attached to the rest of the model. Okay, all of these vertices are separated. So I can kind of pull these out into 3 vertices because there's a vertice for each sort of face of this model at this corner. You don't want that. You don't want all of these to be separated. It's way too much information. So I'm going to undo that, kind of bring them all together. To fix that, all you have to do is select your objects, go up to Edit Mesh, Merge. And it's going to weld all of those vertices together. So now if I go into my vertex mode and I select that vertice, I turn on my move tool, that vertice is going to move around as one welded or joined vertice, and it's going to kind of hold all of those faces together for me. So just as a quick tip, first thing you do after you import your geometry is select it, edit mesh, merge. And then once you merge it, you hold down right click and go back to your object mode. And then you can just click away from your object and it'll deselect all those vertices. And you can go back to just selecting things normally. The second thing you need to do after you import geometry is recenter the gimbal. So what you'll notice, if I select this and I hit W on my keyboard to turn on my move tool, it doesn't pop up. And that's because it's located all the way over at the center of my grid in the center of my modeling space. So what you need to do is select each mesh, go to Modify, Center Pivot, and then I just kind of run through my outliner, and again, I'll just tap the G button on my keyboard to repeat that command. So I'll select the next mesh, hit G on my keyboard, and it's going to center that pivot. So I'll just kind of go through each one of these and recenter that pivot. Okay. And then the last thing I'm going to show you guys in terms of importing new geometry is what happens when you import a piece of geometry that is way too big. Or I shouldn't say too big, but is so big that your geometry doesn't show in Maya. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back into Rhino. I'm just going to kind of mesh this object real quick, pull it over. I'm going to scale this up. So it's really big. Okay. This might happen if you're working on a really large building and you're importing geometry from that building into Maya. And so I'm just going to export this whole thing, call this large object, and save it. And then I'm going to hop back into Maya. So this is my smaller object that's already in here, and then I'm going to import that larger object. Okay, so it came in, but what you'll notice is that if I zoom out too far, it starts to disappear. Okay, the smaller one's fine, it's still there, but this really large object, you'll notice A, it starts to get kind of glitchy, okay, and B, if I zoom too far out, it starts to disappear on me. Okay, so sometimes when you import an object that's really big, it doesn't show up. Even when you hit F, or when you select it in your outliner and you hit F on your keyboard, it still might not be there because it's just too big. That is an issue with Maya's clipping plane option for your camera settings. Okay, what's happening is the object is so big that it gets cut off by your camera's clipping plane. There's a really easy way to kind of fix this. What you have to do is go into your camera settings. So in order to do that, you're going to go all the way up to this little camera with like this cogwheel icon up here, and you'll click that. Okay, that's going to open up your attribute editor, and it's going to bring you to your camera settings. And all you need to do is come down to near clip plane and far clip plane. Okay, in order to make the object appear, if it's disappearing like this, is to add a bunch of zeros to your far clip plane and hit enter, and that object should start to pop up. Okay, the next thing you want to do to kind of resolve that glitching effect where things are like turning black like that is to add to your near clip plane. So I'm going to pump this up to 1, and you're going to notice that it kind of just resolved all of that glitching. Okay, so when you bring in a really big object and it's not showing and you're confused as to why it's not there, you just have to mess around with the clipping planes of your camera. And again, for any camera, you just click on this little icon with the cogwheel where it says camera attributes, and it will pull up this menu. So I'm just gonna delete that, and zoom back into our normal sized object. And so we have this imported massing model. The next thing we're going to do is use this model to start creating our animations. Okay, so let's take this object and start animating it. When I produce an animation of a massing model like this, what I'm trying to do is explore different spatial or volumetric relationships between the parts that I've got already modeled here. And I try and imagine it as if it's like a sequence of events or this sort of like continuous dance between all these different objects and pieces to try and find different types of arrangements and interactions. So for example, I might take this piece, have it move out, rotate, move down, and then push back in. Okay, so now there's like a different relationship between this piece and the surrounding pieces. And don't be afraid to kind of let objects intersect and sort of rearrange themselves. So, you know, maybe this thing scales back and forth, gets bigger and smaller. Maybe it scales up and down, or it gets really small and moves up. Maybe these sort of scale outwards, and maybe this scales larger. And you start to get a different arrangement of objects and pieces. And over time, what you've started with can start to morph and transform into something new. And animation kind of helps you look at each step along the way as if it were sort of a sequence of events that are occurring. I try not to think about it too iteratively though. You always want this to kind of feel like a continuous motion or movement of objects kind of moving around in space. So rather than thinking about it as first it does this, then it does this, then it does this, think about it as, you know, this object is constantly scaling larger and smaller and producing different interactions, pretty much just like how a dance would be, as if, you know, two people are kind of moving around the floor in a continuous motion. There's not really a moment where first you do this, first you do that. It's more of a fluid type interaction. So I'm just going to undo all those modifications real quick, and then we're going to hop in to actually producing our animation and making these models move around our screen. All of that is done through what is called keyframing, where I tell Maya that the object is in this position at its first moment in time, and then it's in this position at a second moment in time, maybe 5 seconds into the animation, and then Maya is going to interpolate that movement in the most efficient way possible. So I'll show you what that looks like. Before we start keyframing anything though, what we want to do is set our time slider to be the length of our animation. I'm going to render this animation out at 30 frames per second. So in order to have a 10-second long animation, I need to have a total of 300 frames. 30 frames a second times 10 seconds is 300. So I'm going to come down here and set these numbers to be 300. That way I have a total of 300 frames over the course of my animation. The second thing I'm going to do is modify the play speed. By default, Maya will play each frame as fast as possible, which is as fast as it can render it on the screen, which is way quicker than what 30 frames a second would actually look like. So we need to edit that setting real quick. So we're going to go up into our Windows, Settings, Preferences. We're going to go into our time slider. And under frame rate, we're going to switch this to 30 frames a second. And under playback speed, we're going to switch this to 30 FPS times 1, and then click Save. And you're going to notice that kind of screwed up our time slider a little bit here. For some reason, it added 75 frames, so I'm just going to knock these back down to 300. And then just make sure that this starts as 1. So that will allow our animation to play as if it were actually playing at 30 frames per second. Once you do that you should only have to switch it once, but you always kind of want to double check that to make sure that's the case just by going into your settings window. So let's start to make some stuff move. There's sort of an order of operations to all of this, which is step 1 is set your time on your time slider. Step 2 is set your object location. Step 3 is keyframe that object. And you kind of need to go in that order, and you'll see why in a minute. So let's start with this plane right here. Okay, and what I'm going to do is animate this plane moving from this location out to this location. And do that to pull it back in. So what I'm going to do is set my time. So I'm going to have it start at frame 1 because that's going to be its starting position. And I've already set my slider to frame 1, so just make sure that it's at 1. Then we're going to set our object orientation, and I'm going to keep it where it is because this is where I want it to start. And then I'm going to keyframe this object in its position. So I'm going to come up to my channel box. And these items here, this translate, rotate, and scale value, these are the things that we're going to be keyframing. So I'm going to click, left mouse click, and drag along these numbers so they're all highlighted. Let go. I'm going to right click and do key selected. You're going to notice a red tick pops up next to all of those numbers, and a red tick popped up in my time slider. What that tells me is when this object is selected, that red tick will show. It means some value in this object has been keyframed at that moment in time. In this case, the values are our translate, rotate, and scale values. So right now, this object is locked into this position at that moment in time. Okay. Now, let's say I want this object to move out here over the course of 5 seconds. Okay. So what I'm going to do is first set my time. So in this case, 5 seconds into my animation is going to be frame 150. So I'm going to set my time 150. I'll then select my object. And the second thing I'm going to do is set its new orientation, which is going to be out here. Okay, so I've now set its new position. The third thing I'm going to do is come up to my translate, rotate, and scale values, drag, select them, right click, key selected. Okay, so now I added a second red tick, which means this object is now locked into that position at this moment in time. So I'm going to switch my time slider back to frame 1, and you're going to notice that object jumps back to that original position because at frame 1, that's where it's locked in. And I'm going to hit the play button, and what should happen is this object over the course of 5 seconds should move from this spot to that spot. Okay, and then it's going to hold that position for the remainder of the animation, and then it'll reset itself and start over. Okay, so that's how you get objects to move. So what I'm going to do is I've got this object here at frame 1. I've got it here at frame 150. By frame 300, I want it to rotate, move down a little bit, and then slide inwards to kind of create a new notching effect between that post and this channel. So what I'm going to do is by frame, let's say 200, I'll have it rotate 90 degrees. Okay, so I'm going to set my time. I'll set this object's new orientation, which is going to be to rotate 100 or rotate 90 degrees. And in order to get really precise with that rotation, I'm going to come up to my x-axis, excuse me, and type in -90 and hit enter. That way I know that object rotated exactly 90 degrees. And then I'm going to move it down some. Okay. And then key that new location at that moment in time. So key selected. So now what's going to happen, if I go back to frame 1, it's going to play or move right to left for the first 150 frames, and then rotate and move downward for the next 50 frames. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is, by the time it reaches frame 300, so the end of my animation, I'm going to have this slide inwards. Okay. Something like that. And I'm just going to eyeball that as close as I can and leave it there. And then I'll key selected those objects. And so now over the course of 10 seconds, this object is going to slide over, rotate, and slide back in. Okay. And so what I do is I kind of just go through each object and start to develop a different series of transformations. So let's take these next, for example. And let's say I want an animation where these are kind of growing and shrinking over time. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'll select these objects, set my time. They're going to be in that orientation, so I'm going to drag select my translate, rotate, and scale values. I'm going to scale key selected these, and then I'm going to go to frame 100, hit enter. I'm going to scale them out. And I'm going to key them there. I'm going to go to frame 200, scale them back in, key them there, and then go to frame 300, scale them back out, and key them there. So now I've got an animation where one object is kind of moving over, down, and back in, and then these objects here are just kind of pulling in and out. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is take this guy and have it kind of scale up and down. Okay. So I'm going to set myself to frame 1, key selected, frame 100, scale this up. I might actually scale it out a little bit too. One thing you want to be wary of when you're creating these animations, you want to try and avoid having two faces of different pieces of geometry directly on top of each other. That's going to cause some rendering issues. So I'm just going to scale these out just a little bit so that is not occurring. And I'll do something like that. So I'm actually going to go back to frame 1. Scale that out some and do a key selected just so those are a little bigger, and then I'll go to frame 100 and create that scaling effect. And then 200, we'll scale them in, and 300. And we can scale them back up again. Okay, so now we'll have something that looks like this. All right. Then let's look at another piece of geometry. Let's grab this one. And in this case, what I'm going to have this do is scale within this kind of notch that's occurring here. Okay, so right now, if I take this scale tool and I scale it out, okay, it's going to kind of get bigger and smaller. And you might even, scale this all the way through so you really get some good change. So I'm actually not going to keep it within that notch. I'm just going to really let this thing kind of grow and shrink. So let's set ourselves at our time. So frame 1. I'm going to undo those changes so this object goes back to its starting position. And then I'm going to key selected. So it's stuck at that spot at frame 1. I'll go to let's go to frame 150 this time. And really let this thing kind of grow outwards. And do something like that. Okay. And then I'll key that moment. And then head to frame 300. And scale it back in. And key that moment. And then we can just real quickly preview this again. So one thing you'll notice is now that I started scaling this, I sort of lost that nice notch moment where this thing kind of came out, rotated, and then scaled back in. So I kind of want to keep that towards the end. So what I'm going to do is pause this. I'm going to go to the end of my animation. I'm going to select this object. I'm going to make sure that it ends back at the location that it started at. And so I'm just going to kind of eyeball that back so those two are pretty close to aligning when it finishes. That way I maintain some resemblance of that kind of notch intersection moment, that relationship between those two pieces of geometry. And then I'll rekey this. Okay. So now it just kind of, as that object rotates back down into place, these pieces scale back down so that it fits. And actually what you could do is get these objects back to that moment before that object starts to intersect. So really at kind of that moment in time is when I really want this to be scaled all the way down, so at frame 223. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to delete this key and rekey it at frame 223. So I'm going to take my frame, I'm going to set it to 300, select this object because those are the keys I want to edit. I'm going to right click on 300 and do delete. And now that key is gone. Okay, and you'll notice that it took that object and now it's showing the position that I have it keyed at frame 150. So what we're going to do is, again, we set it around frame 223. So that's before that object intersects. I'm going to pull this inwards. So that's about as big as that notch. It's still a little wider. In fact, what I can do, because I'm trying to put it back to its original spot, I know this scale X factor should just be set back to 1. So I'm just going to set that to 1. And then at frame 223, I'll key these. And so what's going to happen is switch everything back to 1. I'll kind of scrub through. That's going to kind of move out, rotate, and then before this object starts to move back inward, those posts will be able to accept that notch. Okay, so you kind of want to think about, the relationship between different parts and pieces of your geometry. Again, it's okay to let things like self-intersect and things like that, but there are definitely different kinds of relationships you want to start to pick up on and explore between each piece of geometry. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time just kind of keyframing a couple more of these objects sort of moving around. Let's look at these posts, for example. I'm going to kind of have these sort of shift up and down while they're scaling, getting longer and shorter, so you can see what kind of effect that creates. And I'm going to have them sort of sliding along this piece right here. So they're going to kind of move up and down almost like a piston, and they'll scale while they're doing it. Okay, so set my frame back to 1, relocate that object to its starting position, and I'll key it here. So I'll key selected, I'm going to go to frame 50, and then I'm going to take this, move it down, and scale it, move it down, and I don't want it to intersect that bottom plane, so I'll move it to about there, key selected, and then this one is going to move up and scale. And key selected, I'll go to frame 100, and then this I'm going to move down. And this doesn't really have anything to intersect, so I'm going to let it kind of float all the way down. Actually, it looks like it might be clipping that a little bit, so I'm going to have it move to about there. And I'll scale it and move it down. So I'm going to key that there. This guy I'm going to move up, scale it, key it. I'm going to jump to frame 150, move that down, scale it a little bit, move this back up, scale it a little bit. You can select them both and do a key selected on both of them. Okay, let's jump to frame 250, move that back down, key selected, move this up, key selected, then frame 300. And then at frame 300, I'm going to try and get these back to their original positions, which is going to be 0 on my translate value for Y. So I'll set that to 0. And then I also need to set my scale back to 1. Okay, so I'll set this to 0 and set this to 1. And I will key these. So key selected and key selected. Okay, so now when I play this, it's going to look like two pistons just kind of moving back and forth and then coming to a stop. So it's just a different style of animation. But you kind of want to try and pick up on different sort of aesthetics of animation. So like, think of how everyday objects sort of move back and forth. A piston is kind of a pretty simple thing to do. It's sort of that shifting moment or shifting movement of two objects sort of sliding past each other. So there are certain things you can pick up from with that as well. I'm going to keep this object still just so it serves as kind of a reference point. And then this object here, we might scale bigger and smaller while it's kind of moving back and forth like this. Okay, so I'll do that to reset its position. Set my frame to 1. Okay. Key it at its starting location. I'm going to move it over. I'll set my time first, so I'll set this to 100. Move it over. Let's go with like here. I don't want it to intersect those two pistons that are kind of moving up and down, so I'm going to set that there. Key it. Go to frame 200. And in this case, I'm going to scale it out and sort of move it back. This way. Key it there. And then frame 300. I'm going to scale it inward and move it back over here and do key selected. Okay, so now that's going to be doing something like this. So it'll move out, get fatter, and then kind of come back in. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do is these two objects here. I'm going to have them move down, over, and up, ever so slightly. Okay, so I'll reset those real quick. Go to frame 1, key them at frame 1, go to frame 100. I'll pull them down, key them there. Let's go to frame 200, push them over, key them there, and then frame 300, pull them up to about there. Key selected. Okay. And so this is sort of our final animation. Just sort of a quick tip. You don't want objects flying around the screen. You also don't want objects moving too quickly. So the rate at which these objects are moving right now is probably the fastest you want anything to be moving. And you kind of want to keep everything sort of contained within your masking model. Don't let pieces like fly off to one side. Don't let things get way too spread out. Just keep everything as if it were kind of one single massing model. Maintain your intersections as best you can, things like that. The animation just looks a little better when things are moving kind of closely together and you're kind of always maintaining relationships between all the different pieces of geometry. Okay, so a couple more keyframing tools that you guys should be aware of. The first is how to sort of reset geometry so that it's no longer moving. If I select a piece of geometry, you're going to notice that all of these have this kind of pink or red highlighted tick next to them, which means it's keyframed. If I want to remove all of the keys from this object so that it's no longer moving, I'm going to drag select, right click, and go to break connections. And that's going to remove all those keys, and now that object no longer moves. So I'm going to just undo that real quick. The next thing that you guys should be aware of is how to move keys around. So let's look at kind of this plane here that sort of comes out, flips down, and moves back in. Let's say I wanted that whole animation to occur faster than I actually have it now. Right now, it takes between 1 and 300 frames to complete that movement. Let's say I wanted it to only take 100 frames to make that whole movement. Okay, you can click and drag on these tick marks, which is where that object is keyed on your time slider. So right now, between frame 100 and 150, it moves from right to left. But let's say I want it to move from right to left within just 50 frames. I'm going to click and drag this keyed tick mark to frame 50. In order to do that, what I'm going to do is hold Shift on my keyboard. I'm going to click and drag across that tick mark, and you're going to see this red bar kind of pop up. And I just want to make sure that that tick mark lives inside the red bar when I release. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is on these two middle arrows, I'm going to click and drag along those arrows, and I'm going to push that tick mark so it gets back down to that kind of 50-second spot and release. So now when I click in my time slider over here, you'll notice that tick mark is now way over at the 50 mark. So instead of taking 150 frames to move from right to left, it only takes 50 frames. And now that animation is going to occur a lot quicker. And then it will slow down. Okay. So again, if you want to move a moment where something's keyframed to a different moment in time, you hold Shift, click and drag, and then you can click and drag on those two middle arrows. If I wanted to move both of these keyframed moments, so the right to left movement plus the rotation movement, I can hold Shift, click and drag across both of those tick marks, click and drag on these arrows, and move them around. Okay. So that's moving tick marks. You can also scale an entire animation. So for example, if I select all of the objects, it's going to show all the tick marks for every single piece of geometry. Okay. Right now, this whole animation occurs over the course of 300 frames. Well, let's say I wanted it to take twice as long. You don't need to rekey everything. All you need to do is change your time slider so that I have now 600 frames. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale all of this outwards to 600. So I'm literally just going to hold Shift, click and drag that bar across all the tick marks. You don't need to grab the 0 moment, so I'm going to stop before then. Okay, so I've got all those tick marks selected in that red bar. And then what I'm going to do is click and drag on the outer arrow, not the middle ones, because all that's going to do is move those keyframe moments around. What I want to do is sort of scale those moments. So I'm going to click and drag. And then if I click on and drag on one of these outer arrows, not the middle ones, but this outer one, okay, I can pull and stretch that animation outwards so that it lasts longer, okay? So I can literally just hold shift, you know, start really close to the last keyframe, click and drag all those animations inwards, and then stretch this animation all the way out to wherever I want it to be. So now that's going to take about twice as long for that animation to occur. So that's how you kind of take a whole animation and stretch it out so that it's longer. And you can do the inverse, you can stretch it so that it's shorter. The point being is if you want to take your animation and make it longer or shorter, you don't have to go in and rekey every little keyframe spot. You just select everything and stretch it. That should be about it. That's how you kind of get geometry to shift and change around and move around your modeling space. So now that we have that set up, the next thing that we're going to get into is how to set up your camera. We'll set up an orthographic camera, and I'll show you guys how to keyframe and move that camera around so you get kind of a dynamic video where your camera is kind of panning around your object while these things are moving in space, and that's what we'll use to render through. One thing I want to get into before we start creating cameras is the ability to kind of take this animation, pause it at a certain moment in time, and extract that 3D model to be used for things like diagramming, 3D printing, or exporting to another software to add different architectural elements to it or take it to that sort of next level of architecture. So we have this kind of moving animation, right? And all this geometry is kind of moving around. Well, let's say I'm scrubbing through and I find a moment in time that I think is really interesting. So for example, let's skip to frame 100. Okay, let's just say I like the orientation of geometry at this moment in time. What I can do is select all the geometry, do Control D on my keyboard, and that's going to duplicate that geometry. While it's still selected, I'm going to turn on my Move tool and click and drag that duplicated geometry off to the side. What you're going to notice is that because it's duplicated, it's lost all of its keyframing. So that object is locked into that orientation. So if I scrub through again, this object's moving, and this one is now staying still. So I can take this geometry now and export it out to Rhino, SketchUp, or Revit and add more architectural detail. I can send it out to be 3D printed or laser cut, any number of things. And so you can pause this animation at any moment in time, select it, Control D, turn on your Move tool, scale it out, and start to produce almost a series of iterations for this model at each moment in time, and produce diagrams, drawings, whatever you want to do. So in a sense, once you have this animation set up, you have 300 individual moments or 300 individual iterations of this thing transforming. And so you can kind of use that to your advantage in terms of like how you want to showcase or diagram out this model. Okay, so let's get into setting up a camera that we can render through. I'm going to delete these duplicated massings so that all I'm left with is our animated one. So this thing's kind of moving around. What we'll do is we'll create a camera, and then I'll show you guys how to animate the camera so that it sort of pans around or across the model as it's animating. It gives you a little bit more of a dynamic animation. What you should know is that there are two types of cameras in Maya. There are perspective cameras, which is what we're looking through now, which gives you a perspective view of your model. And then there are orthographic cameras, which are similar to your top, front, side views. What we're going to do is create an orthographic camera so that we can set up sort of an axonometric view of this model as it's moving around. I prefer to use axon cameras for more diagrammatic animations. I think it just looks nicer in terms of the quality of image that you get. And it's a little bit easier to understand the spatial relationships that come with it. Perspectives are obviously more used for like animations of what it's like to be in the space rather than looking at it from further out. And so for this, the point of this tutorial is going to be to produce this sort of diagrammatic animation. And so we'll create an orthographic camera first, but just know that there are two types of cameras that you can create. When you create a camera, it actually shows up as an object in your scene. So you can kind of move it around that way and keyframe it, and we'll get into all that kind of stuff. So why don't we go ahead and make a camera. I'm going to zoom out a little bit because when you make the camera, it's going to plop it at the center of our scene, so it's going to put it way over here. But basically what you do to create a new camera is you go to Create up at the top, Cameras, and you have three options. You have a camera, which is only a camera. You have Camera and Aim, which is a camera with a little aim point attached to it. You have Camera, Aim, and Up, which forces sort of an up direction to the camera. We're going to use a Camera and Aim. Camera, Aim, and Up kind of confines you a little bit too much, and with a camera you have a little bit too much freedom. So the Camera and Aim is a really good middle ground, especially for the kind of animation that we're going to produce. Instead of clicking on this, though, we're going to click on this little options box out to the right. You'll notice in any of these menus you have all these little boxes to the right of some of these commands. This opens up a sub menu for this specific command. So what we're going to do is go to Create, Camera, Camera, and Aim, but we're going to click the little options box. That's going to open up this menu. What we want to do is, because we want to create an orthographic camera, we're just going to scroll down, and I want to make sure that under orthographic view this is checked. Okay, and then you're going to click Create. And what that's going to do is drop down this camera. So I'm going to select it, hit F on my keyboard to zoom selected, and it's created this camera for me. If you look in your outliner, it will also have created a camera and an aim. So that's this camera group 1. This group includes the camera and the aim. So what I'm going to do is select the camera first, hit W on my keyboard, turn on the move tool, and I'm just going to pull this camera a little bit further away from the aim. And I'm going to select the aim, and you can kind of move that around to get a feel for what that aim does. Basically, it controls what the camera is looking at. And so it's really nice to be able to control the camera in relationship to where it's looking. It's very helpful. So this is how we're going to kind of create and modify this camera. One thing you'll notice, this gumball is sort of aligning to the shape or the orientation of the camera. We do not want that to occur. We want this gumball to always be straight up and down or aligned with our world axes. So as I showed you guys before, I'm going to open up the tool properties of this camera, or of my gumball, by clicking this little icon up here with the hammer. And I'm going to set the axis orientation from object to world. And that's going to snap that gumball back to our world orientation. That way, no matter how I move this, my gumball is always aligned to the world. That's going to be really helpful in terms of editing or moving around our camera. And same thing with the aim down here. It should also be set to world. So first thing we want to do is kind of move the camera group together as one. So I'm going to select the group in the outliner and just kind of position it close to the model. And really what you want to do is get that aim as close to the center of the object of our massing as we can. So I'm going to actually hop into our top view, select the aim, and just kind of put it at the average center of this massing model. Okay, and then I'm going to hop into our side view or front view and put it, roughly at the center of everything this way as well. And so that aim should now be kind of buried inside that model. It becomes a lot easier to select the aim through your outliner. That's why I always have my outliner open. We can also close this tool settings box because now the aim is kind of lost inside all of that geometry. So it becomes really hard to select. So you can always select it through your outliner. And then the camera, what we're going to want to do is kind of move it off to the side a little bit, and then push it up some. And what this is setting us up for is sort of an axon view where we're looking down on it like this. Okay. And there's a way to preview this camera, which I'll show you in a second, but you just kind of want to get it oriented a little bit first before we do that. Okay. So we got this camera positioned kind of right here. Okay. What we're going to do in order to preview what that camera is seeing, I'm going to tap the space bar to go out to our 4 viewports. And then I'm going to click, or what we'll do is change one of these viewports so that it references this camera. In order to do that, I'm going to go to, let's say, the side view. I'm going to go to the menu up for this viewport right here. I'm going to click Panels, go to Orthographic, and I'm going to select Camera 1. Okay, so this is now looking through that camera. All right, and you'll notice if I come over here and I start to move this around, that view is going to update for me. Okay. Now the problem is right now this camera is zoomed really far in to our model, which we don't want. We need to back it out some. You can't just move this further away from the model. That's not how an orthographic camera works. You actually have to change what's called the orthographic width, and that's found in the camera settings of this object. So let's zoom this camera out some. What we're going to do is click this little camera with the cogwheel to open up our camera settings in our attribute editor. And we're going to scroll all the way down. We're going to maximize this orthographic views menu. And this is now set to 30. See what happens when we change it to 45. Okay, it just zoomed out a little bit of this model. All right, let's change it to 65. So we just zoomed out a little bit more. I'm going to click the camera up here and sort of pan it up some so I get a little bit more of an axon view. And then I'm going to set this to 80. Okay. Now we're really starting to get like that nice axon view that we're kind of going for. Bring it down a little bit, and kind of set it to something like that. And then I'm going to select the aim. And what you want to do is try and get the overall massing to fit in the center of our screen. Okay, so just kind of something along the lines of that. Okay, one quick tip, do not ever use this to model with. Don't start zooming and trying to pan around and rotating in this view. It's going to take some time to get used to. You always want to do your editing and your modeling inside your perspective camera. If you start panning around and rotating in this view, you're going to basically what's called breaking the camera, and it's not going to start working properly. And then if you start to keyframe the camera and you start rotating in this view, you're going to screw up all your keyframes. So just remember that any modifications, any 3D modeling you do should happen always in your perspective view. This camera one view should only be for previewing what's going on through that camera. Okay, so you'll notice I'm always using this view up here to make modifications to what that camera is looking at. Okay. Now what we can do is I'm going to tap spacebar on top of this to maximize the viewport, and I'm going to hit the play button so I can see what's happening. Okay. I'm also going to turn on object edges for this, just so I can see the objects a little bit better by clicking that little icon up here. And so a couple of things are happening. The object starts out pretty centered, and up until about this point everything looks okay. It's a little off-centered now, like the object looks a little high on the screen, and then at this moment that object starts to fall off our screen. We want to avoid that at all costs. We always want the whole object to stay confined on the screen. Okay. So the next step in terms of our camera setup is to animate it so that it's moving with the massing, so that the massing is always staying on screen. Before we do that though, we want to turn on what's called our film gate and set a video resolution for the size of our video. Okay, right now this box here, that's just a randomly sized box. Okay, it has nothing to do with the image that's being rendered out. It has nothing to do with the size of the video that we're going to render out. In order to turn on your film gate, you're going to click this little icon up here, the square with the blue circle in the middle of it. That's what's going to turn on your film gate or resolution gate. This square is going to be the actual extents of our video. Okay, so that's what you want to make sure your model is always inside of. Okay, you don't want it to fall off at any point in time. Okay, so that kind of clipping, we're trying to avoid that. Up at the top, this is your video resolution. Right now it's set to 960 by 540. We're going to change that to 1920 by 1080 because that's sort of typical video resolution. In order to change that, we're going to come up to our render settings, which is this little movie board thing with the cogwheel on it. So we'll click that. It's going to open up our render settings. We're going to change a couple things a little bit later on. Right now I just want you to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and under image size where it says preset, change this to HD 1080 and then click close. And you'll notice your resolution changes to 1920 by 1080. So what we want to do is make sure that this thing isn't falling outside of our camera view. Okay, so what we're going to do is you kind of have to go through not really frame by frame, but we're going to go through our video in order and get this thing to start to move around so that this is always on the screen. So we're going to start here, and getting your camera to move is the same exact process as it is to get geometry to move. You set your time frame, you key it in a location, you set your new time, key it in its new location, and it'll start to move. So I'm going to select this camera. I'm going to make this the starting location for the camera, and I'm going to grab the aim. I'm going to pull it up just a little bit and slide it over just a little bit, just to kind of get this massing centered on the screen. Okay, and I'm going to go to my channel box on the right, and I'm going to key both the camera and the aim. So I'm going to drag select the translate values of my camera. All I need to do is the translate values, and I'll key those. You don't need to key the rotate values because those are controlled by the aim. So you see they're blue like this. You can't key those because what we'll do is we'll key the location of the aim instead, and that will control sort of the rotation value of the camera. So I'm going to key the translate values of the camera, and then I'm going to select the aim. I'm going to key the translate values of the aim. So that's locked in at frame 1. Okay. Now the movement of the camera, I'm going to have it just kind of slowly pan across over the course of the animation to this moment here. And then I'm going to pull it up a little bit. And then I'll select the aim and pull it over. So again, this massing is centered on our camera. Now, I kind of messed up there because I changed the position of the camera and aim before changing the time on my time slider. So you'll notice if I go to frame 300 now, it's going to flip everything back. Okay, so now I got to kind of reset the camera. And that's why it's important to follow the sort of order of operations in terms of keyframing. Always set your time first. So now I'm just going to take that camera again. I'm going to pull it over to that location, its ending position. I'll select the aim and kind of do the same thing. Pull it over. So that looks pretty good. Centered, everything's on the screen. And I'll key these in their new location. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to frame 1. I'm going to click inside this box so it's activated, and then hit the play button. And so you can see what the animation now looks like as it moves around the model and as the model is shifting. I clicked inside this box because Maya will only preview one box at a time. So if I click inside my perspective camera, it's going to preview that motion there, and I can click inside each one. But obviously I want to be previewing it through this. So I'll click inside that box to sort of activate it. Okay, so it's okay, but you'll notice as I scrub through the animation, it starts out pretty good. That's okay, but at this moment in time, I'm starting to get things falling off the screen up at the top. And then by the time you get here, things are really starting to fall off. And then at the end, it looks okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through like every 50 or so frames and just sort of check the location of our camera and aim. Okay, so I'm going to start at 0. I'm going to work my way to about frame, let's say frame 80. So that's where things start to get too close to the edges here and here. And what I'm going to do is kind of reposition the aim so that things are a little bit more centered and things are kind of staying within the screen. So I'm going to select the aim, and I might just kind of move it a little bit to there and maybe pull it down just ever so slightly. Okay, so that's a little bit more centered now. And then I'll key that aim at that moment in time. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want to start to zoom out a little bit because this object is getting a little big. You always want some breathing room at the edges of your video. You don't want this object to be filling the entire screen. It ends up looking way too big. So what I'm going to do is have this orthographic camera zoom out. And again, that's done with the orthographic width in the attribute editor. So I'm going to come down here to this view, click the camera settings or the camera attributes, scroll all the way down to my orthographic width. And now I want to start keyframing this orthographic width. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch myself back to frame 1 because I want to key it at 80 at frame 1 because I know 80 works at this moment in time. So I'm going to right click and set key at frame 1. Then I'm going to jump ourselves back to that frame 80, and I'm going to back this out some. So if I make it higher, it's going to zoom out. So I'm going to set it to 90, and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to keyframe that at that moment in time. All right. So now if I scrub through this, it'll be nice and zoomed in here, and then as it pans around and we get to frame 80, it's going to start to zoom out, and it'll keep that object centered on our screen. Okay. So then I'm going to kind of scrub through a little more. It looks pretty good. So at about this moment in time, it's a little off-centered because this piece is sort of flipped up, and this piece hasn't quite come down all the way yet. So what we're going to do is key our aim in a different location to kind of recenter our camera. So I'm going to select the aim, my outliner, turn on my move tool. I'm just going to kind of click and drag this up a little bit. Not much. About it. And then I'm also going to zoom out just a little bit more. So I'm going to, again, click the camera attributes. Actually, I need to key that aim real quick. So I'm going to go to my channel box and key that aim. Then I'm going to come to this camera attribute and zoom out a little bit. Maybe we go to like 95. It looks okay. And I'll set that key. I'm going to scrub through a little more. So now the bottom cube is starting to fall off, okay, and we want to avoid that. So I'm going to go to frame 180. I'm going to select the aim. Now I'm going to pull it down some. Kind of set it right there. And I'm going to move this aim over a little bit to keep that piece of geometry kind of centered on our screen. Something like that. So I'll set and key that new aim position at frame 180. And then we'll kind of keep moving along. And we end up back here. So not too bad at frame 180. You'll notice that this is starting to fall off a little bit more there as it flips up. So at frame 180, I might actually select this and set this to 100 so it jumps out a little bit more, and set that key so that flip never actually ends up too high. And then maybe I take the aim and pull it up just a hair. And reset that key. And really all I'm trying to do is just make sure this geometry stays as centered on that screen as possible. Okay, and so then we kind of come back to the end here, and at this point I would say we want the camera to kind of zoom in just a little bit more. The aim position looks good, it's centered. So I'm going to select the attributes again. And at this moment, I'm going to start to zoom in back to like 90. And set that key. And then I'll backtrack just to make sure that didn't really screw anything up. Alright, so that looks pretty good. So let's maximize this viewport. Let's set ourselves to frame 1 and preview this animation to see how that looks. Cool. So that's how you set up a camera. It takes quite a bit of time to get used to how to manipulate and properly keyframe the camera so that your object is always staying on the screen and it's not kind of falling off. So it's going to take you guys some time to really get used to that sort of modification. Just remember, it's all about keyframing the location of the camera, the location of the aim, and then under your attribute editor, you need to change or keyframe the orthographic width to zoom in and out. So you're kind of just playing around with keyframing those three options until you get the camera correct. One piece of advice, you want less keyframes for your camera. If you start to keyframe this at like every 10 frames or so, you're going to get this kind of jagged or jumping action as the camera moves along. You want to avoid that. So, try and keyframe the camera as little as possible to get it to do the movement that you want it to do. So you can avoid any jumping. You also want the camera itself to move really slow. You don't want it to feel like a roller coaster. You don't want it to feel like a bug flying around. You just want everything to be kind of nice and slow and smooth so that it's easy to register what's going on. The next thing we're going to get into is setting up still renderings, applying a material, and then we'll jump into rendering out the actual animation. Okay, so we've got our moving model and we've got our camera set in a position where we're satisfied with the way everything looks, things moving as we want it to, the camera's ready to go. So let's jump into rendering. The first thing I'm going to go over with you guys is how to render out individual stills just as an image with a material applied, and then we'll hop into rendering out the actual animation. When you render out an animation from Maya, you're not actually rendering out a movie, you're rendering out a single image for each frame that is in the animation. And then we'll take those images, bring them into AfterEffects, and compile them into our final movie. So we'll kind of run through that whole process using this animation. So the first thing we're going to do is apply a new material. Right now, if I click the render button, which is this blank movie clipboard up here, nothing's going to show in our scene. Just give it a second to render. Okay, comes up black. Okay, one reason for that is we don't have a light source. Okay, I'm not going to get into lighting for this tutorial. Instead, I'm going to show you guys how to apply a material that doesn't require any lighting in the scene. It's called an ambient occlusion. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to select all of the geometry in our scene. And if it doesn't select like that, all you have to do is come over to your outliner and select the mesh here. So once all your geometry is selected, you can hold down right click, go to assign new material down at the bottom, release. It's going to open up this little menu. You want to come under Arnold where it says shader, select that, and then just click AI ambient occlusion. And your geometry color will change a little bit, it's fine. And you can just kind of set it there. So now when we click the render button, our geometry is going to start to show up. This AI ambient occlusion is really great for really basic renderings, especially diagrammatic ones. It produces shadows and lightness and darkness based on geometry proximity. So where two pieces of geometry get really close together, it produces some darkened areas. And where geometry is kind of more out in the open and further away, it has that sort of white look to it. So we'll be using this type of rendering for this animation. The other beneficial part to this type of material is that it renders quickly. This only took 11 seconds. You want to keep your rendering times down to a minimum, basically because if you have to render out 300 frames, that's 300 individual images. So you have to multiply that number times 300 to figure out how long it's going to take for this to render out. So if your images are taking a minute to render, then that's 300 minutes. That's, you're getting up to between 3 to 4 hours to render out the whole animation. And that's only for an image that takes 1 minute to render. If you have a lot of detail, a lot of light, materials, texture maps, bump maps, all of that kind of stuff, you can start to see images that take, 5, 10, 15, sometimes a half hour to render. And all of a sudden, in order to render out that whole animation, it could take, a day or two. So you really need to keep an eye on your rendering time. I would say, try and keep everything below 30 seconds for an individual rendering. So we're at 11. That's pretty good. We're going to keep it there. If you want to save this image, just do a file, save image. I'm just going to pick a spot to save it. I'm going to save it as a PNG. Just call this test image 1. The reason why I always save as a PNG is because you don't want a background to be applied to the image. Right now it's showing a black background, but when I save this as a PNG, there won't be any background at all, which means if I want to change the color that's behind this object, I can put any kind of image or color behind it, and I don't have to go in and crop out all of this object in order to do that. There's just nothing behind it, which is what you want it to be. If I save this as a JPEG, all of that black is going to come with it, and it's going to be impossible to change the background without having to go in and crop out all of that black. So we'll save it as a PNG, click Save, and then you can close out of that window. And then I'm just going to go into the spot where I saved it. So you'll notice it has a white background now, and that's just because it doesn't have a background associated to it. You'll also notice that it ended up saving a little bit darker than what the rendering showed. If you need to preview the rendering, you can just click this little eye icon, and that'll bring up the last rendering. So you'll notice that the saved PNG, that area in there, it's much darker on the saved image than it is on the actual rendering. You can brighten this up in Photoshop or After Effects using your levels. That's how you would bring back that brightness if you want to. I like the contrast. I think it looks a little bit nicer. It gives a little bit more crispness to it. So I'll usually just end up leaving it like that. But if you notice your images are coming out way darker when you save them as compared to the actual rendering, just bring them into Photoshop and up the levels. So we're going to close out of that. Usually what I do before I send the actual animation is I'll take a couple test renders at different parts along the animation to make sure it looks good. Obviously I'm not going to test render every single frame, but I usually check the beginning, 2 spots in the middle, and then the end. So that's frame 1. Everything looks pretty good. It's easy to read, easy to kind of understand the different parts and pieces. I already tested one in the middle, so I'll just kind of hop to the end and render this as well. Just to kind of check that. One thing you will notice, it's a little grainy in certain spots. If that bothers you, you want a much cleaner rendering. What you can do is select your object, any one of them, open up your attribute editor, use these arrows and push all the way to the right till you see AI ambient occlusion. This is the material that's applied to it. So you click that and you get all the material settings. If you up the samples, so let's say I make this 5 and then I render it, that graininess is going to start to go away. The problem is it's also going to take a little bit longer for your image to render out. So just know that as you up that image sampling limit, it's going to look cleaner and it's going to look better, but it's also going to take a little bit longer to render. So I'm going to close that. The other option under your materials you should know about is the near and far clip plane. When I went over how to export and import geometry from Rhino, at the end of that I went over what would happen if you imported geometry that was too big. When you do that and you change the near and far clip plane of your camera in order to get that geometry to show, you need to change the near and far clip plane of your AI ambient occlusion, or it's going to look all white, which is not what you want. Okay, so what you need to do is go into your camera attribute settings, check to see what you made the near and far clip plane there, match the numbers here. Okay, I didn't change that to this camera because the object isn't too big, so I'm just going to leave these where they are right now. But if you ever change your near and far clip plane in your camera, you then have to change it on your material setting as well. This is only for AI ambient occlusions. Other materials, different settings, don't worry about it. So that's our material set and ready to go. We've tested out a couple different single images, so let's set this up to render out our actual animation. The first thing we're going to do is come up to our render settings. I'm going to scroll all the way to the top. There's just a couple settings we want to change. First of all, image format, set that to PNG. Under frame animation extension, see where this says single frame? We don't want it to say single frame. We want to pick one of these down below. I like name_number.ext. That tells it to render out multiple images. The next thing we're going to do is frame padding. I'm going to leave that at 4. I'll get into what that is a little later. Start frame should be 1. End frame, in this case, 300. Those numbers are going to be whatever you want them to be in terms of your animation. By frame, we want it to render out every single frame, so we'll set that to 1. Renderable cameras. We want to set this to camera 1. Okay, you can check that by looking at the bottom of your viewport in the camera you want to render. Camera 1. Make sure that's camera 1. Make sure HD 1080 is selected. Resolution is 72. You do not want to up that. If you're doing a still image and you want it to look a little nicer when it's printed, you can change that to 150 or 300. But for a moving video, 72. Fine. You don't really see a difference when you change that in terms of the video. So we can close this. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is load our rendering script. The one drawback to the educational license for Maya is that if you render out your animation using the correct way, which is through Maya's batch renderer, you get this huge watermark plastered all over your video, and it looks really bad. So a colleague wrote a script that sort of bypasses the watermark. So that's what we're going to use to run the renderings for our animation. So I'm going to save this real quick. you always want to save your Maya file before you run the rendering for the animation. Sometimes it freezes and locks up and you have to force shut down Maya. So just save it before you run the rendering script. So what we're going to do, the rendering script is looks something like this. It is a Maya script file. This is what it's called, ICUS render view BR-1. I'll make sure this is available to you guys. You just want to save this file somewhere on your computer and just kind of leave it there. Okay, so I've got it saved under a folder, and it's just going to hang out there. In order to load that script, you're going to come down to the bottom right hand corner of Maya where this little white box is, click it, and that's going to open up your render or your script editor. Okay, and this is where you load or type in any code to run a script. The script is already typed out, so all we have to do is run it and hit the play button. So in order to load it, you're going to go to File, Open Script, and you're going to search for that file. So Maya tutorials, this ICUS render view br-1.mel. I'm going to click Open. What that's going to do is create a new tab down here. I've already done it once, so that tab is there as well. But what you want to do is copy all of this text. So I'm going to select it starting at the top, drag all the way down. You can't right click in this, so you're going to do Control C to copy. Then you're going to switch over to your Mel tab, do Control V to paste it. So all of that text just got pasted in. Then you're going to come up to the top and hit this blue play button. Okay, nothing's going to happen. That's okay. What you want to do is then go back to that script tab, and you want to copy this last line of text in this hatched box area. Okay, this ICUS underscore render view BR semicolon. So I'm going to copy this, Control C, go back to my Mel tab, Control V, and that's going to show up like this. Once that's there, hit the play button, and it's going to pop open your render view. You can close out of that. And it's also going to pop up this little window, and this is what we want to see. Okay, so now that this window is up, you can close your script editor. And there's just a couple things we want to set here. Okay, so under directory, we want to set a location for our images to be saved to. So I'm going to go into Maya tutorials. I've already done a couple, so I'm going to do one more. I'll call this test animation 3. Select that path. Just double check it. Image name, don't leave this as untitled, so I'm going to call this anim, short for animation. Start frame 1, end framed 300. Image format PNG. Frame padding, set this to 3. Your frame padding needs to match how many digits are in the last number of your frame count. So 300 has 3 digits in it, so I have a frame padding of 3. If this gets up to 1000, then I need a frame padding of 4, because there are 4 digits in 1000. Once it gets up to 10,000, 10,000 has 5 digits in it. I need a frame padding of 5, and so on. That's really important to make sure it's set, because if I don't have enough frame padding, Maya is not going to understand how to properly save your files. Safest bet to do is just to put this at 5 and leave it. You can always have extra, you just can't have less than. So you put that at 5 and it's just going to fill it in with zeros. It's okay. Camera, make sure that's set to camera 1 or whatever camera you're rendering out of. Image resolution should be HD 1080. And you should be good to go. Again, I'm just going to save this real quick before I hit the render button. The minute you hit this render button, it's going to start rendering out each one of those 300 images. And it could take a little while. So we'll hit the render button. let it go. Once it's done, we'll kind of come back, look at the images, make sure they look okay, bring them into After Effects, and we should be good to go. One thing I need to mention, the folder that you're saving your images to, the only thing that can be in that folder are these images. You can't have other files or random things hanging out in there. That's an After Effects thing. So just make sure you have a folder that is specifically used only for saving these images for this animation. So I'm going to click the render button, and then it's going to start rendering. This is your overall percentage of your render. So it's rendering frame 1 of 300, remaining 299. Down at the bottom here, in the bottom left, this is the amount of time or percentage per image. Okay, so 5%, 6, 7 of the image that it's on. And you just want to make sure that that's not taking too long. You know, again, under 30 seconds is where we want it to be. So it's going pretty quick. So you'll just let your computer sit, render out, and then come back when it's done. Unfortunately, you can't really do a lot when it's rendering out. The most you can really do is surf the web. Using things like Photoshop, Illustrator, or other 3D modeling programs, it gets pretty laggy on even really good computers, so you just kind of gotta let it do its thing. Time your renderings properly. You know, usually I send renderings overnight, or at least during times when I know I'm not going to be using my laptop. Okay guys, so the renderings have finished. You can go into the folder that we kind of dropped them into. Let's see, which would be test animation 3. So you should have anim.00001, depending on what your frame padding was, all the way down to 300. They should all look something similar to this. Nice high contrast occlusion renderings. And like I mentioned before, the only thing that can be in this folder are these images. You can't have other files in here or other things hanging out. It's also important that these are labeled sequentially. So don't change the names of any of them. Again, that's another After Effects thing. So we'll close out of this and close out of Maya and open up After Effects. So the goal here is going to be to import our images as an image sequence into After Effects, and then we'll kind of preview the animation and then send it out to render using Adobe Media Encoder. So you need to make sure you have that installed as well. You should get this window that pops up first. You can click New Project over on the left, and that's going to give you this. I'm not really going to get into the interface or anything. We're not going to use After Effects all that much. We're just going to import some images and render out the animation. So what you're going to do is in the center here, this is where your movie is going to pop up to preview, but you have to create a composition first, which is sort of your animation or your movie, similar to your canvas in Photoshop or Illustrator. So we'll click New Composition. We're going to set our preset to be HD 1080 and 29.97. That's 29.97 frames a second. Then I'm going to override the frame rate just so it's an even 30, make it easy on us. And then the time down here, we did a 10-second animation, and so this time stamp is done. This is frames, seconds, minutes, and then hour. So what we're going to do is set this to be a 10-second long animation. So I'll set that to 10, to 0, and that to 0. And then our background we'll just keep as black and click OK. So that's created a new composition. It's created an area down here where anything in our video is going to show down here, almost like layers. And then this is our time slider, so we can scrub through our animation. In order to import our image sequence, we're going to double click in this empty space over here. It's going to open up an import window. And we're just going to navigate to the folder that all of those images were located in. All you need to do is select the first image and then come down here and make sure that PNG sequence is checked. It may not say, depends on what image type you're dealing with. If it's JPEG, it's going to say JPEG, but you just want to make sure the sequence option is checked, and then you click import. So what that's going to do is import all 300 images as a sequence. If sequence is unchecked, it'll import 300 individual images, which is not what we want. So right now this animation lives up here in our library. It's not actually in our composition yet. So we're going to click and drag it down to the bottom left, this area here, and drop it in. And now it's appeared in our composition. So we can now preview this. If you just tap the space bar, it's going to start playing the animation. What you're going to notice is that animation kind of has to buffer first, the first time you play it through. So it's not playing real time right now, but then once it finishes buffering and then it plays through, now it'll play at real time, nice and smooth. Okay, so that's our animation. You can use, there's a lot of tutorials online on like how to add text and get into like motion graphics and that kind of stuff with After Effects. That's what it's really good for. We're not really going to get into any of that for this. I just want to show you guys how to bring in an image sequence and render out your animation. So now that this is in here, what you can do is go up to Composition and Add to Media Encoder Queue. And that should automatically open up Adobe Media Encoder. Okay, so once this is up, if you just give it a second, your video should pop up over here. The presets, you want to do H.264, so you can click this down arrow and select H.264. You want high quality, 1080p HD. And then you want to choose a spot to save it by clicking on that blue text under Output File. So I'm just going to save this to the desktop. Call this Animation 1. Save. And then hit the green play button up at the top. And that should start rendering out your final video. Once that's done, you can close the Adobe Media Encoder. You can also close After Effects. You can save the file if you want to. For little things like this, I typically don't. I only save my After Effects files if they're like big, long compositions where there's a lot of videos playing at once and transitions and that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to bother saving that. But you can come down to your saved video file and open that up and preview the animation. Alright, so that's how you render out an animation from Maya.